Hello, everyone. Today we are going to talk about Libya, Gaddafi, and switching the story, changing the narrative when it is to a government's advantage to do so. Just altering the story, blaming someone else, or switching the accusation to some other country when it is to the advantage of the accuser to do so. We have all heard about the Pan Am bombing when a plane blew up and killed around 109 people. We've all heard this story. And we've all heard the typical accusation that it was Gaddafi who did it, right? Gaddafi, this Bedouin tent dweller dictator, just so happened to get up one morning. He woke up out of his tent, he drank some black tea, maybe, he sweet-talked one of his concubines, sweet-talked one of his female bodyguards, I don't know. He did something like that, did an interview with a journalist from 60 Minutes, and then he sat back on his chair, or in his case, it would be one of those, Middle Eastern carpet chairs, and he was sipping his Persian tea or black tea or whatever, his coffee, his North African coffee, and he said, I want to blow up a plane, and just wanted to blow up a plane, right? Just wanted to kill some Westerners, right? Some people from Scotland. Wanted to kill him. And so this is the narrative, right? We've heard this numerous times. It's very common to hear about how it was Gaddafi who killed all those people in that plane. But what is rarely ever talked about is how that was not the initial narrative. And so right now I'm reading a book. It is called Escape to Hell and Other Stories by Muammar Gaddafi. And I really want to understand Gaddafi in Libya, because Libya is a huge part of the news right now. It's a central focus of foreign policy, be it American foreign policy, NATO foreign policy in general. Libya is being inundated by foreign governments, mercenaries and militaries from other countries. The French military is in Libya. The Italian military is in Libya. We have Russian mercenaries in Libya. Mercenaries from the Russian Guns for Hire organization, Wagner, which is an interesting name for a Russian mercenary group, because Wagner is a composer, or he was a composer, who was also a Nazi. And it's just interesting. It's just, I don't know, I find it weird that Russians would pick a name like that for their organization. But you have these Russian mercenaries in Libya, Russian troops. You also have Sudanese Guns for Hire who are working under the Russians. Turkish troops are in Libya. It's just riddled with foreign militaries. And Western governments are obsessed with Libya for one reason and one reason only, and that is geopolitical power through controlling natural resources like natural gas and oil, of which Libya is riddled with. Turkey just recently made a deal with the UN-backed Government of National Accord that Turkey would be allowed to drill for natural gas in Libyan territory. And then you have the French backing the huge rebel state in Libya, which is under Khalifa Haftar. The Italians have been angry with the French because of this, because the Italians supposedly want to follow the UN line and support the Government of National Accord. Anyway, just giving you guys a brief detail about that. It's a huge center for foreign policy quagmire. And so right now I've been reading about Libya because, of the whole focus on the country. And I really want to understand Gaddafi, because this was a guy that the U.S. murdered, all right? And they killed this guy because they wanted to create a vacuum, a power vacuum in Libya, and they really wanted to destabilize Libya. Because as long as the Middle East is divided and riddled with violence, more powerful countries can exploit it and take its resources. That's just how it's been for a very long time. So this book talks about the Pan Am bombing and how the narrative was switched. And it says here, and this was written, the introduction is written by Pierre Salinger, who was a journalist. He did a lot of work for ABC. He was actually quite a reputable journalist in his time. And he did a lot of investigative work in the Pan Am situation. And he says here, we should look back to recent history. In April 1986, the Reagan administration decided to bomb the capital of Libya, Tripoli, to try to assassinate Gaddafi. The reason for the bombing was, according to the administration, a Libyan terrorist attack against Americans in Berlin. During the bombing of Tripoli, hundreds of Libyans were killed, including one of Gaddafi's children. So they actually killed one of Gaddafi's children, and we're talking about how he's this huge monster who just hates America for no reason, just hates America. A few years later, the American and British governments, after investigations into the Pan Am 103 bombing in December 1988, decided that the bomb had been placed on a plane in Malta that connected to Pan Am in Frankfurt, Germany, and exploded over Lockerbie in Scotland. In their investigations, the two governments, the American and British governments, the two governments were aware that the bombing had been carried out by Iran and Syria. So the initial story was, well, the Syrians and the Iranians did it. They killed all those people over Lockerbie. And it says here, after the Gulf War, these governments wanted to see progress in the Middle East peace talks between Israel and Arab countries and the Palestinians. They decided to change their decision and attribute responsibility for the Pan Am bombing to Muammar Gaddafi. So from it was Syria and Iran, it was Gaddafi who did it. They switched the narrative. Why? Because it was expedient for them. It was to their advantage. It was necessary for them because they wanted some sort of a peace deal between Israel and the Arab countries. Syria and Iran were involved in that process, and so, well, they needed those two countries. So no longer were they responsible for the Pan Am bombing. Now it's Libya. And it says here, after the Gulf War, these governments wanted to see progress in the Middle East, peace talks. Okay, I already read this. And it says here, the reason was that the Syrians and not the Libyans were crucial to Middle East peace talks. So it was advantageous for them that Syria be involved in the peace process. Syria, you're no longer getting blamed for the Pan Am bombing. And Salinger says here, I was the only one who interrogated the two Libyan suspects for planting the bomb in Malta. That interrogation confirmed to me that the Libyans had not done it, and that the bomb was put on the plane in Frankfurt, Germany. And more interestingly, I discovered that Libya had made important changes. For example, while in Libya, I was allowed to visit an area that the Americans said was being used to create chemical weapons. So again, they were doing the same stuff that they did to Saddam to Libya. They were saying, oh, Libya is involved in making chemical weapons. They got terrorist training facilities there. So he says, when I went there, it was clear that they were not creating such armaments. I was allowed to visit areas where the U.S. government had proclaimed as terrorist training camps. They had put to a stop, it says here, that they had been put to a stop and turned into places of residence for Palestinian immigrants. So they said, oh, there are these terrorist training camps in Libya. They're making chemical weapons in Libya. And Salinger went to the site where the Americans were saying they had terrorist training camps. And what did Mr. Salinger find? He found Palestinian refugees, not terrorist training camps. But of course, to a lot of these neoconservative fanatics, it's, well, those refugees are probably all terrorists anyway. So yeah, terrorist training camps. So it says here, they had been put to a stop and turned into places of residence for Palestinian immigrants. Moreover, I discovered that Ibrahim Bishari, then foreign minister of Libya, had written letters to the United Nations. and to U.S. Secretary of State James Baker, offering them the possibility to send in investigators to verify that what the Libyans were saying was true. Neither the United Nations nor the U.S. government replied. So initially, it seems that there were these training camps, but then the Libyan government got rid of them and replaced them with a place for Palestinian immigrants. The point is that it is very common for countries to switch narratives to their advantage. And we've seen this many, many times. And it's very interesting. Like back in the 1950s, they don't talk a whole lot about this. Israel was actually planning on attacking American buildings in Egypt. And then to blame those attacks on Islamic terrorists or Egyptian terrorists. And say, oh, these are attacks on Americans. America needs to join Israel in a war against Egypt. And it didn't happen. But the fact is that Israel actually planned on doing this sort of stuff, this sort of false flag attack. This also goes right in line with the whole Gladio operation that NATO was up to. So, for example, there were numerous terrorist attacks in Europe. You had the Brabant shootings, you had the Piazza Fontana bombing, you had the Bologna massacre. These were pretty horrific crimes. And they said initially, oh, this was done by the communists. And then it was really, the reality was that these terrorist attacks were done by nationalists, backed by NATO, in order to create a narrative that it was the commies who did it. And we need to have nationalism against communism. We need to boost up right-wing sentiment. I think the same thing has been going on with the whole refugee crisis. You have all these refugees that came into Europe in 2015, hundreds of thousands of them. And this refugee crisis, it was the result of what was happening in Libya, NATO policy in Libya, NATO policy in Iraq, NATO policy in Syria. And the result, the geopolitical result in Europe of this refugee crisis was what? A boost in nationalism. And you had this horrendous narrative that was being inundated throughout the internet of, oh, this is a war against the white race. And what was that about? It was a way to boost nationalism. My theory, my hypothesis is that the refugee crisis was actually something that was wanted by the powers that be in order to fulfill what NATO was trying to do through Gladio. And so it was, this sort of switching of the narrative, it was seen before the NATO bombing of Libya. What were they saying? Oh, Gaddafi was behind the Pan Am, and they pushed that narrative back. Behind the Pan Am bombings and all that stuff. And it's like, well, if Libya was really behind the Pan Am bombings, then why the hell didn't you bomb them when it happened? When you found out that it was Libya? Why did you wait until, 2011 to do it? So they pushed these certain narratives, and what was the result? One of the results of the bombing of Libya was the refugee crisis. What did that lead to? A revival of vicious European tribalism and nationalism. And we are seeing the increasing rise of that today. And there has been talk coming out of Germany and the United States that we are really to expect another refugee crisis into Europe. What's that going to do? It's going to further invigorate the nationalist cause in Europe, and it's only going to bring more problems. And if this thing increases, if this monster, this Leviathan increases and engulfs Europe, eventually it's going to implode into a war. And if a war happens in Europe, it's going to escalate into a global conflict. Like World War I, when a conflict happens in Europe, it inundates like a flood, and it becomes a global conflict. We saw this in the World Wars. We saw this in the 30 Years' War. So things are going to get pretty ugly, but things are going to get pretty ugly on the back of a false narrative. It's kind of like what happened on the eve of World War I. The Archduke Ferdinand was killed. The Germans and the Austrians really didn't care about Franz Ferdinand. In fact, they really didn't like him so much. But they saw his murder, his assassination by a Serbian nationalist, as a great opportunity to start a war in the Balkans, and through that escalate the conflict into a full-out European war in England, France, and Russia. In fact, it's been proven that Germany was already planning on starting a European war in the late 1800s, way before the death of Franz Ferdinand. But the death of Franz Ferdinand proved to be a very successful narrative to start a war. So really, the next global conflict is going to happen through a false narrative that the masses are going to believe. People like myself are going to say, hey, don't trust it, but that's not going to happen. Anyway, hope you guys have enjoyed this message. Hope you guys have learned something from this message. You guys just heard some theology. God bless.